to the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jaclyn Streitfeld-Hall, Research Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. In today's episode, I will be talking with Ambassador Stephen Rapp. Ambassador Rapp is currently a fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Center for the Prevention of Genocide and a senior fellow at Oxford University. He previously served as a senior trial attorney and chief of prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and as a prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. During the administration of President Barack Obama, he served as U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. Thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Rapp.
Very good to be with you.
Ambassador, you've had an extensive career in international justice. What initially drew you to working in this field?
Well, I think it goes to my own past, sort of an association when I was involved in politics, and in my early legal career of always association with the underdog, people that were victimized often by the economy and also by crime. I'd been a victim of myself at 21 of a particularly vicious crime, which I've been lucky to survive. Nonetheless, I spent most of my early career as a defense attorney, sometimes representing people who were a little like the folks that had victimized me. But strongly believed in that situation and using the tools of the law to achieve justice. I was fascinated by what had happened after World War II and read a lot about it, particularly the Nuremberg trials and holding Nazis to account, and later during the Cold War, where sometimes the U.S. was, I thought, on the wrong side, associating with dictators that were committing torture and genocide in Guatemala, and so-called dirty war of mass torture and murder and disappearance in Argentina. Really wanted to see prosecutions prevail. But then in 1993, I was fortunate to be appointed, because of my public work, as a United States attorney, as the chief federal prosecutor in my relatively small district from a population perspective, about 1.5 million people of northern Iowa, half the state, and was in charge of federal law enforcement, frankly, in an area where we had very few federal investigative agencies. So it involved reaching out and finding evidence ourselves, working with the local enforcement authorities, particularly working with victims organizations. And it happened at a time when the level of violent crime across the country was much, frankly, higher than it's been recently, though it may be going up again, and really wanted to involve the office in every way I could in protecting communities from those that were predatory, whether those were gangs committing vicious and selfish acts for their own glory, so to speak, or riches, or whether it was even powerful corporations that were exploiting people or polluting the groundwater. So that was very much the cause, but saw the law as something that sitting in the prosecutor's seat could be used, and not to sort of vindicate authority, to show the government's all powerful and everyone has to bow down, but rather as a tool to even the odds in a way to represent those who were victimized, and to use the law against those who were powerful economically or because of their willingness to turn to acts of vicious violence, and bring the law to bear in those situations. Then in the mid-90s, I saw what was occurring internationally with the end of the Cold War and with the horrible crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, that the idea at Nuremberg was being resurrected through the UN Security Council, and that justice was being sought at an international level on behalf of the victims of those horrendous crimes. And of course, we'd gone a long time after Nuremberg without any possibility of justice. And I was very excited about that. And frankly, sought out opportunities to go assist, and indeed was even solicited by Washington to see if any of my assistants would like to go, for instance, to The Hague. And I found none who were, but I said, I am. And they said, no, you can't go. You're the boss. You need to stay in Cedar Rapids and Sioux City, Iowa, and tend to the store. But I continued to be actively interested in that. And so in 99, I began the process of actually pursuing the idea of moving to a tribunal when my term ended, and looking to be an international prosecutor, not to be a boss, maybe not, certainly not initially, but to be a team leader who would work on the ground with the victims and the survivors, develop the kind of evidence that I developed in cases in federal law enforcement that brought in insiders, still insisted that they be held accountable, but recognized their cooperation through and the fact that they'd already engaged in rehabilitation through by protecting them and by perhaps providing even a concession in sentencing if we could get true information that could be corroborated and prosecute and bring to justice the people that were the most powerful, the true authors of these crimes, not the sometimes children that are recruited to commit the crimes, but those who make them happen for their own selfish ends. So sought out that opportunity and went to Washington, visited in the office that I never imagined that I would someday lead, visited the Office of War Crimes Issues, met with one of the assistants, Pierre Prosper, who was then working for the first ambassador at large in this area, David Sheffer, and Pierre had, a California prosecutor, had gone to the Arusha Tribunal to prosecute the Rwanda genocide, was a junior assistant trial attorney, P3, but because of the nature of Arusha, was called in to be part of the team in the first trial on the crime of genocide. And by the time that trial ended, all the people above him either had been fired or left, and he was actually the person that in court carried the day and obtained the first conviction in the history of the world for the crime of genocide. It wasn't possible as an American even then to be promoted, so he went back to Washington and was working for David Sheffer, would eventually be appointed ambassador himself under President Bush. But his advice was, don't go to The Hague, go to Arusha, go to the Rwanda Tribunal. And I followed his advice and found a vacancy, a P5 trial attorney, senior trial attorney position, asked for the help of the office in making sure that I was considered, and was fortunate to be interviewed in January of 2001 and to get the offer in April. And as soon as I had it, I resigned as U.S. attorney, left the office on the 18th of May, 2001, and within 4 days was in Arusha, Tanzania, and was immediately put in charge of the media trial, a trial that had begun 7 months earlier, but in which the two leaders had either fired or been let go. And it needed a leader to steer the trial to success, and that became my intense immersion in international criminal law beginning in May of 2001.
Wow, that's really a relentless pursuit of being involved in international criminal justice. I'd always been curious about how you made that jump from being a prosecutor in Iowa to international justice, so that's fascinating. Since you've mentioned the media trial, I know a lot of historical firsts for international justice were achieved through both the ICTR and during your time on the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Were there any particular highlights that emerged from your experience prosecuting cases in those situations?
Well, there were a lot of highlights. There were also lots of challenges. Certainly, the media trial and getting things organized and putting it together was I think the hardest and the most challenging job that I've ever had. When I arrived, I sort of thought maybe the case had been prepared, and we were in the process of going through a script that it was in pretrial brief, and discovered that we hadn't done much to prove the elements in the case. The evidence was hardly in perfect shape. I mean, We had what we thought were about 300 hours of broadcasts of RTLM radio. We had the issues of Kangura. There were about 70 of them. And we had those in evidence. But very few of them had even been translated into either English or French. They were in the native language of Kinyarwanda, of Rwanda. I think about 50 of the 300 had been translated into one of the two languages. Only maybe about a dozen of the broadcasts had been translated into both. So we really didn't know what our evidence said. And then the Kangura, indeed, I think 5 issues have been fully translated out of the 70. So we had that intense challenge. And of course, even if we proved that the broadcast, for instance, had been inciting, which of course involved complex issues of interpretation of the language, and particularly the broadcast was quite often coded and related to Rwandan proverbs and even things that had supposedly been said that reported in the international media one could not find in the broadcast material that we had. And so, proving that it was inciting language was also a challenge, and the experts that were going to help us on that had a blow up with the tribunal and had refused to work with us. And then we had the question of proving, particularly as to the radio, that the 2 men that we had on trial, Ferdinand Nahimana and John Bosco Baragwiza, were actually responsible for the station at the time when all these allegedly nasty broadcasts were made. They'd certainly been involved in its formation a year earlier, but we weren't trying them for actually being on the broadcast speaking. We were essentially saying that they were in control of the station, and proving that they were in control during the period of the genocide was also intensely challenging. It was a little less of a problem with the newspaper, but there the newspaper had not published during the genocide, and the crime that we were seeking to prosecute was direct and public incitement to genocide. So and we were limited to 1994 under the statute that limited us to crimes committed in 94. And some of the nastiest things in Kangura, like the 10 Commandments, have been published of the Bahutu, were published 3 years earlier. And even then, if something's broadcast or published a month or 2 before the crime, is that direct incitement to the genocide? It's a little like in America. People would say, well, no, that's not a direct causation to act. You can't say that's protected. So, we had enormous challenges, and we had barely scratched the surface in terms of proving any of that when I arrived. So, you had the challenges of the UN running a court. And UN can take, a year and a half or 2 years to fill a vacancy. We were in Arusha, where we did have generators to continue with our power when the public power went down, which was every day. But we, didn't have enough paper for the copy machines or toner, and we were quite often rushing out to local shops and producing our document copies that we needed. So, it was one of those things where, and nothing would happen unless you made it happen. No paper would move from one office to another unless you personally carried the paper. So you had all of that at the same time that you had the need to do something that had never been done in history before, which was to convict people involved in the media with the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide.
Given the challenges you've just highlighted, what were some of the highlights of the tribunal, and how did you overcome these challenges?
Well, there were highlights, and there were great things, and it was certainly my experience in the 2 international courts in which I worked were the most frankly significant things of my life, and it involved eventually being able to put on the evidence, eventually being able to incorporate everybody in the team into part of that effort, in getting at least enough of the broadcast translated, getting the sort of local experts to testify about the proverbs and the meaning of those particular expressions, being able finally to present in court the audio of the absolutely crazy talk in the background in Kinyarwanda at the same time that we strolled the translation in English and in French, and then to have testimony as well where people were on the receiving end. Those broadcasts were happening, and then they were immediately attacked by the Interahamwe in these places where thousands were hacked to death, and where a few survivors died under piles of corpses of members of their own family, and we were able to put the case together, and indeed with some assistance of international experts like Alison DeForge, show that that the defendants continued to have significant control over the station, over the radio during the course of these messages, and obtained the first convictions in history in December of 2003 for direct and public incitement. I remember well that day in December of 2003 when the judges read out their decision, led by the South African Navi Pillay, who was president of the tribunal and later an ICC judge, and found these men responsible for genocide and crimes against humanity, and effectively sentenced them to life sentences at the trial level. And I remember talking to survivors afterwards, who, and of course I was apologetic in the sense that we weren't able to do everything that we had hoped to do, or obtain convictions on every part of our case. And but frankly, they were overjoyed. I remember one saying, when he was in Rwanda, the men that we were trying were too high up ever. He could never be in the same room with them. They were so powerful and above and all controlling of that society. Yet they unleashed these messages that had caused the death of his entire family. And saying to me that day, this was the greatest moment in his life, to see them being stood before the whole world and convicted of responsibility for incitement that caused the death of his family and hundreds of thousands of other innocent victims. In Sierra Leone, which is a different kind of court, which I was appointed to as chief prosecutor in January, or took the position up in January of 2007, we had a different kind of court in the sense that it wasn't a UN created court with all international staff. It was about 60% national staff, and it involved appointments of both national and international people to offices like mine. I was the international prosecutor appointed by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. My deputy was appointed by the president of the country. And I thought because of that, and because we were doing our work not 500 miles away, which was the situation in Arusha, Tanzania, where the Rwanda tribunal was headquartered 500 miles east of Kigali, Rwanda, the center of the crimes, we were doing the work in Freetown in Sierra Leone, the very city that had been attacked, in which thousands of people had been killed and raped, and children had been abducted when that city was taken by the brutal rebels of the RUF in January of '99. And we could look out the window and see houses still destroyed from those crimes, and meet with the survivors in the street and in our outreach program where we traveled the country to describe the work of the court. But it was extremely gratifying as well to finally obtain convictions for crimes that people thought would never have, and against individuals that they thought were absolutely beyond the capacity of their system of justice to ever reach. The most exciting, of course, was the fact that we were able to try the president of the country next door, who had alleged and re-alleged, and we eventually proved was responsible through his support of the RUF, so that he could gain control of the diamonds in Sierra Leone, responsible for their campaign of amputations and rape and murder victimized hundreds of thousands. We had to try that case in The Hague because the local leaders and the leaders in the countries in the region thought that trial in Freetown, where we had tried the other three big trials of the leaders of each of the groups that had been involved in the mass killing and the mass atrocities, we needed to try that one in The Hague. But we did everything that we could to get back the message and to make sure that the people of Sierra Leone knew what was happening, and that screenings of the videos was held all over the country, using generators and broadcast in community halls and schools and in open spaces during the evenings when you could do a projector and show what was happening in the court. But I'm reminded of what people described to me as the arrival of Charles Taylor at the court in March of 2006, which was frankly before my arrival, and the day when it was possible to bring him from arrest in Nigeria, something the court had been pushing for, through Liberia, and to bring him to the court in March of 2006, when thousands of people stood on the rooftops as the helicopter settled into the court grounds and its detention center, and people always told me that was the day that they never thought they would see. And indeed, in the end, with the evidence that we were able to put together in the trial in The Hague, we were able to convict Taylor and send him to prison for 50 years, as we were able to convict each of the individuals that we charged. It was, the kind of thing that one can only dream of in terms of the result of the justice process. I've been back to Sierra Leone several times since. There last, just as Ebola was beginning to take hold in the country. Thankfully, that has passed. But I remember people telling me that whatever the problems of the country, they'd gone through several elections, and there had been no lethal violence, and power had changed, basically because the lesson had been taught: if you commit these crimes to gain power, you're going to face justice. And so I think we did, in effect, in an imperfect process that prosecuted only a handful of individuals in a country that still remains challenged in many ways, show that justice could protect people by going after the crimes in the past, could protect people in the future, be part of R2P, part of sort of a pillar 3, sub 1, which is the use of justice in a very tough way. Sometimes in that case possible, so I guess sort of pillar 2 in cooperation with the country and regional authorities. In other situations like former Yugoslavia, really something that was imposed by the UN, but you can through those kinds of methods protect people. And that's, I've been spending my time since leaving both courts trying to achieve some measure of the same kind of accountability for past and ongoing violations in the hope that will deter violations in the future.
It's really incredible to hear how these trials really impact the populations who were affected by the crimes, even, when the outcome is years after the crimes were perpetrated. Your work has significantly strengthened the perception that criminal justice plays a key role in the prevention of mass atrocities. And as you mentioned, it's important to Pillar 1 of R2P. Based on your experience, how have criminal justice mechanisms functioned as a deterrent to perpetrators of mass atrocities?
Well, it's a question of risk and reward. Understand no one quite knows what works in criminal justice, and people can debate the concept of deterrence. I certainly see at the national level, if you begin to prosecute certain companies for polluting, other companies will stop doing it, and you can take action about certain kinds of crime, healthcare fraud, other things that involve people that are making calculations of risks, and if there's some risk of punishment, of prosecution, that will have an effect. In the case of street crime or other kinds of offenses, it may be a little less clear, and one needs a strategic approach that deals with different aspects of it. But my own view of international crime, of mass atrocities, is that these are very much crimes that are planned and prepared, and the killers are trained and supplied and deployed by leaders who are using the commission of crimes against the innocent as part of their strategy for maintaining or gaining power and the wealth and authority that goes with it. And you can see that in many of these situations where the authors of these crimes are not sociopaths. They're very calculated, perhaps narcissistic, but people who calculate advantages. And sometimes these things work. Sometimes committing atrocities invites you into a peace process, and then you get power sharing. And when you finally get all power, you continue these crimes. And unless we send a clear message that there are going to be consequences, that they're not going to be benefits to commission atrocities, we'll get more of them. The challenges that we have now is where we do have these historic examples where it was eventually possible to achieve justice, most recently with the finalization of the Mladic case, though he was on the run for 16 years before he was brought to trial. And it's been 10 years now through that whole process of preparation, trial, and appeal, where that case has been concluded, 26 years after the crimes. But that certainly sends a very, very powerful message. And that's an important one. And it's not just a message to the former Yugoslavia, but in other places, say Syria, the leader thinks himself protected by the Russians. They vetoed the referral of that case to the ICC, vetoed almost everything else that's come up in the Security Council that would put any measure of accountability on Syria. And of course, Assad's not part of international courts such as the ICC, and so in a situation like that, how do you achieve justice? And frankly, as a result of the perception that he can get away with it, we see crimes that were committed in the past, even in World War, even crimes that were, I should say, acts that were prohibited in the past, like the use of poison gas or the prohibition on attacks on hospitals or medical personnel, or prohibitions on forcible disappearance. Those norms have largely been well established. The hospitals for 150 years, poison gas almost from the end of the World War I. The forcible disappearances really from the end of the Dirty War in Latin America. We haven't seen a lot of those crimes, and here they're all being committed in Syria in a massive way because of the perception you can get away with it. So that's the difficulty we have, and so many of these situations. Myanmar, in which the ICC has a small part to play, it found because of forced deportation into a state party, Bangladesh. But a lot of the other situations in the world are beyond the reach of the ICC or the UN because of non-membership or because of the protection of a veto-wielding member of the Security Council. So there we have to find other ways to achieve accountability. And a key part of that is in my view, developing the evidence in a highly professional way, and then working to find a way to bring that evidence to bear where you do have an opportunity to go into court. And most prominently in the case of Syria, that's been in third countries, particularly countries that have welcomed a great many refugees, where they really have an interest in justice and can use the concept of universal justice and their nexus to witnesses and often to the presence of a perpetrator, foreign national, in their midst to achieve justice in national courts. Of course, that's limited. There are only a certain number of cases that are going to be made that way, and they may not be the highest number of actors. But that's often the name of the game right now. Not that there aren't other avenues relief. Obviously, in Myanmar, we have the case brought in the International Court of Justice by a good friend of mine, then Minister of Justice Ba Tamadou, who was a junior trial attorney when I was in Arusha, a very talented one who rose after I was there to a prominent position in the tribunal and then went home after his dictator, the dictator of his country for 22 years, was overthrown. He was invited back by the president to become Minister of Justice. But then when the horrible clearance operations happened in Myanmar, not the horrendous crimes for a long period of time, but the operations in which the Tatmadaw, the military, committed mass killings and burnings and rapes and drove 800,000 Rohingya men, women, and children over the border into Bangladesh in August and September of 2017. He took up a role within the Islamic countries. Gambia is one of the smallest, but certainly a member, to become the sort of chair of their working group on this subject in the Islamic Conference, and then eventually to arrange for his own country, Gambia, to take Myanmar to the International Court of Justice on the Genocide Convention, and to get the support of the Islamic countries, many of whom don't agree about anything else, Iran, Saudi Arabia in the same place, to support, hiring the firm and building the evidence and using what had been obtained in UN inquiries and by civil society to build this case and take it to The Hague, not for criminal liability or responsibility, but for the state responsibility. And we remember what happened in December of 2019 when the government led by Aung San Suu Kyi actually came to defend their military and the International Court of Justice the following month by a unanimous vote, found that there was jurisdiction, even though Gambia was a long ways away from Myanmar, because this is an obligation of all the world under the Genocide Convention, and other countries from distant, faraway places can bring a state to the ICJ. And they found, at least preliminarily, there was jurisdiction and that there was cause to issue provisional measures requiring action by the government to prevent genocide, certainly, or the reoccurrence of genocide. Of course, we've since had the overthrow of the government and the military, who've gotten away with crimes in the past, committing even worse ones now. But that case continues. So, I mean, these are examples of, where it's possible to use evidence and obtain some level of accountability, though not yet sufficient accountability to change the conduct, but certainly message to other countries who don't want to, and other leaders who don't want to be similarly international pariahs through their action. I would note that it goes beyond judicial means to things like global Magnitsky sanctions, the ability of states or groups of states to put into effect sanctions against human rights abusers and violators, and then potentially even prosecute those that continue to aid those individuals. And so, even though that's not perfect and doesn't include all states with those sanctions, they can be very, very powerful tools. All of these things, however, require the development of strong evidence. And just because somebody has a horrible reputation or is blamed by popular media for certain crimes, that's not enough. And so most of my work these days involves those efforts to strengthen documentation within the UN, but I should note that whatever the UN is doing, it may not be able to go into these conflict zones because of security reasons or because of a resistance of the government who may be implicated in the crimes. And it requires the work with civil society, building the evidence according to a high standard, and the UN then playing a role through these new mechanisms in vetting that evidence and corroborating it and building files. And so this is all part of that process of achieving accountability in places where we don't have the options that we had in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Sierra Leone.
Thanks. We've definitely are witnessing a moment in which there are a multitude of investigative mechanisms being developed for atrocity situations, whether it be the commissions of inquiry for countries like Syria, there was a commission of inquiry for Burundi, the fact-finding mission for Myanmar, a fact-finding mission for Venezuela, as well as these sort of new innovative mechanisms for preparing files for criminal prosecutions, including the IIIM for Syria, the investigative mechanism for Myanmar. Given the success of the UN mandated special tribunals, why do you think there's been this shift towards more investigative mechanisms over tribunals? And what do you think the value of those mechanisms is?
Well, let me just put it back on a personal level. I mean, I was under President Obama and under Secretary Clinton and under Secretary Kerry, U.S. Ambassador at Large for 6 years in an office that we called War Crimes Issues, and then retitled halfway through the Office of Global Criminal Justice. And that office had been established essentially to work with international tribunals, recognizing that just because they had a mandate didn't mean that they were going to get any evidence without state assistance, and they were certainly going to be able to get any arrest without state assistance in one, developing the information about where the individual might be located, and then pressuring sometimes reluctant states to assist in that process. But where I probably went to the Hague during the course of my 6-year tenure, I probably went there 35 or 40 times, and I was busy traveled more than 1,200 days during those 6 years. But increasingly went to Geneva as well, and to the Human Rights Council, and that was because the Security Council, which had established the ad hoc tribunals and it called into creation the Sierra Leone court, authorized the negotiation that led to its creation, and had referred Darfur and Libya to the ICC through the Security Council. The Security Council was blocked, and if you're going to get any kind of accountability, you had to go to multilateral accountability. You had to go to a body where there was no veto, and that was possible then to do in Syria, and as you said, in other situations like Myanmar, Venezuela, and now Belarus. Probably about a dozen of these places, and understand that was done under a human rights law mandate and not under a criminal law mandate, or by a human rights body, I should say, that doesn't normally deal with criminal law mandates, though they would put criminal law-like language into the responsibilities of these commissions, and so that became one way in which you could obtain some kind of global accountability. Now, of course, the main thing that these commissions produce are reports, which are limited to 23 pages under UN rules. So they can include very voluminous supplements and appendices, and they may get attention for a day or two after they're published, but they're not sufficient to get criminal justice cases going, even though they do sometimes make determinations that the violations are crimes, and quite often prepare lists of suspects, in a couple cases published in the reports, but usually delivered confidentially to the High Commissioner. So this is the not ideal, but it's the way that it's been possible to obtain a more neutral process through a multilateral body to find the facts and develop evidence. But as I note, as I said earlier, it needs to also involve people working with these bodies to develop the evidence in the field, because they hardly ever have access to the scene of the crime. And that's usually denied by complicit governments. And so they need well-produced evidence, open source material, but also witness statements. And as I've done in the course of chairing a group called CIJA, we brought more than 1 million pages of documents out of Syria, security documents that were found or frankly abandoned in various security centers in towns that were lost, at least at one time, by the government. And that material that CIJA brought out, which has gone directly to cases like the prosecution in Germany and the indictments in France and elsewhere, has also been fully shared with this mechanism that was established on Syria, that takes this up a step from commissions that make reports to actually pulling together files and building dossiers, essentially like an office of the prosecutor, but an office of the prosecutor without yet a specific court to go to. And I think that's a good model, imperfect. I'd much prefer it if we could then, let's go ahead and make a tribunal. And there's some ideas for doing that, but they're complicated because they'd have to happen without the Security Council and often without the consent of the territorial state. So putting a tribunal together under those circumstances would be challenging. That may be the next thing that we look at, in which states pool their jurisdiction to try these cases to the extent that they can get their hands on perpetrators. But that's the next step. But I noted that I came from Iowa. I was famous for the Field of Dreams, where the theme was, if you build it, they will come. And I'm a case builder, and if you build cases, I think eventually justice comes. I mean, you present evidence that's so strong, so compelling. If you can find a jurisdictional avenue, you can get that evidence heard, and prosecutors and authorities are frankly thrilled to see it, because they've got a lot of situations where they don't have such evidence. So it's an imperfect process, but it's the one that we have, and the one that we may be dealing with in the future. And so it won't be a world in which we can rely on the UN Security Council, and it won't be one where we can necessarily rely on all states. We have to rely on those states that are committed, a coalition of the committed, to achieve justice. And that's certainly what I'll be spending the rest of my life working on, hoping to achieve through this process something like we achieved in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, or the former Yugoslavia, and the process sending a message to the perpetrators of mass atrocities, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that if they do the crime, they will face consequences. And because of making that a credible message through justice, we can in fact protect people from these atrocities.
Given the challenges with the Security Council that you've mentioned, what can states, or particularly this community of committed states, do to prioritize the pursuit of justice and accountability and make bringing an end to impunity less politically charged? What is your dream for the future of international justice at this point?
Well, it really involves the development of an ecosystem. You're not going to be able to fix it in one particular place, but it involves states and their development agencies, but also states in the region in terms of how they orient their priorities to making an environment where civil society organizations are encouraged, supported, protected. Human rights defenders are protected and encouraged and supported in developing evidence of these crimes in a proper way, and that requires states making an investment and not a on again, off again kind of investment, but understanding that that's an ongoing need, no matter where the cases may eventually go, and then it involves states supporting multilateral mandates to the extent that they're possible in bodies like the Human Rights Council, and we see it even going beyond that, where the African Commission for Human and People's Rights is just established a commission of inquiry for the crimes in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. We'll see if they get the resources that they need to do that. So it's not just at the level of the UN. So, states need to then support and make sure that they have the right expertise, the right investigators to be able to do that job, and that the people that assist them and provide the evidence are protected, and that the evidence is protected, and then as well governments need to support efforts of national war crimes units through organizations like the Genocide Network, which pulls together all European countries and 5 countries outside the EU, including the US, as observers in coordination of prosecution efforts. Ideally, having the benefit of mechanisms like the Syria one and the Myanmar one that have now been established either by the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. But whether we have those or not, it's going to be a matter of, one, making sure that the evidence is gathered and that the witnesses and evidence is properly secured and protected, and then that avenues are opened for justice in terms of the statutory language and in terms of of having the right kind of investigation and prosecution units. And then to the extent we can do that collectively between states with joint investigative teams, like the one that worked on MH17 in Ukraine, the shoot down, which involved 5 countries and a prosecution in the end in the Netherlands, those kinds of efforts need to be encouraged. So that's where I see the future going, as much as we'd like to return to where we were with the resolutions that passed the Security Council, as much as one might dream of a more universal ICC. I'm realistic enough to know that given the nature of our world, that may not be within the cards. So we have to achieve the next best thing. And to be frank, with many actors moving in this area and with the proper support, it can be greater in terms of its impact than a single international court with a limited ability to try but a handful of cases. So I'm not a pessimist in this. Am I an optimist? Yes, I guess. Show me a glass that's damp, and I'll tell you it's half full. But this glass is filling, and it's filling from the ground up in a way. With the civil society organizations, is the key to it, not the top down, the Security Council or great powers making it happen. But everyone who's committed to R2P and to the concepts of atrocity prevention and protecting the weak from the powerful needs to contribute in whatever way they can.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you'd like more information about the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, or populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at globalr2p.org and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook at GCR2P.